Okay, so resuming Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology, which is The Masks of God, Volume 1. We're about halfway through the book now, and we are at Part 3, which is called The Mythology of the Primitive Hunters. What I've done is I've taken a bit of a break here to go back and read the first volume of his Historical Atlas of World Mythology, which is called The Way of the Animal Powers. And it's this monster here, The Way of the Animal Powers, the Historical Atlas of World Mythology, Volume 1, which was originally released as a single big volume, and later was split into two separate volumes. They split in half later on. I like it better as a single volume, just keeps all the information in one place. The Way of the Animal Powers. So everything in this book corresponds to the second half of this book. The hunting myths, the myths of the animal powers, whereas the second volume of the Atlas, The Way of the Seated Earth, relates to the material that we have already covered here with the mythologies of the planters. And the reason why they're arranged differently is because Campbell was using two different models. In the older book from 1959, Primitive Mythology, the model is archaeological. That is to say, as in archaeology, for example, where you start with the Upper Paleolithic first, you dig through that, then go down to the Lower Paleolithic and dig through that. So that's the approach that he was taking in Primitive Myth, where he's starting with the more recent planters and then going back to the earlier hunters. But in The Way of the Animal Powers, it's strictly chronologically organized, and it's done in an evolutionary manner, in the way of a zoologist or a biologist trying to construct a history of the earth, only doing it in terms of the evolution of the religious forms. He starts with creation myths in The Way of the Animal Powers. It begins with a series of creation myths, then moves to our scientific creation myth, as it stands, or as it stood when he wrote it in 1983. Then he goes through that and tracks what he calls the Great West to East Dispersal of the movement of the hunters as they go across, as the glaciers melt. They go across Siberia, across the Bering Land Bridge, down through North America, down to South America, and all the way to the tip of South America, the Tierra del Fuego. And then other hunters have gone across the other way through Spain to North Africa, where they've been pushed gradually south down to South Africa, where they exist today as the Kung Bushmen, a Capoid race. So there are two different arcs there for the world of the hunters because they split and went in two different zones. Now, Campbell, I think that the four biggest influences on Campbell were Leo Frobenius, Oswald Spengler, Carl Jung, and Heinrich Zimmer. Those are his four masters. But I think of all four of them, I think nobody had a greater influence on him than Leo Frobenius. I think that's the one, and the one who's practically none of whose writings are available in English. But he is the formative one. He's the one who drew up all these maps and charts and diagrams and different kinds of African atlases and so forth that Campbell is retrieving and bringing into the Anglo world with things like the Historical Atlas. But especially this idea of the Kulturkreis, the culture circle. And there are 5 of these Kulturkreise that Campbell has borrowed from Frobenius. So if we imagine the Earth and we imagine the arc of the hunters as they leave from the Franco-Cantabrian province of the Pyrenees with the Paleolithic, the glaciers melt, the Magdalenian epoch comes to an end, and the hunters are migrating, following the game as the glaciers pull up and reveal all this grazing land. So the game are going out there, and the hunters have to follow the game. So they end up going across Siberia into the New World, and they become marginalized there, where they're still there to this day along the Arctic Rim. That's a Kulturkreis, a culture circle, literally, if you look at it top down, that goes along the Arctic Rim. They're all hunters, and that is a shamanistic hunting zone there. So there's that zone, and then the bottom zone, which is the other half of what happened to the hunters who got marginalized, who moved as the glaciers melt. Some other hunters went into North Africa, where we find animal art in the Saharan Atlas Mountains and also in the Fezzan, in the Sahara back around 10,000 BC when it was still verdant, it was still green, and the Tassili Plateau that Terence McKenna liked so much. And then they gradually got marginalized as the Sahara desertified. they got marginalized, and these hunters were slowly pushed around East Africa down to South Africa, where they eventually have remained as the Kung Bushmen. And then going across to the southern zone, we have the Andaman Islanders off the coast of Burma, who are now extinct but were hunters, and in Melanesia, and then going across with the Australian Aborigines, also as hunters, and then across to Tierra del Fuego, who are also hunters. So there's a few sprinkled remains going across this other culture circle that extends from South Africa going across to South America, the tip of South America. So in between, though, now we have a couple of other culture circles that are very important. The one that is immediately below the Arctic hunting myths and hunters is, and one that Campbell doesn't use very much actually, is the zone of the nomads, the nomads of the Eurasian steppe, primarily, which are Indo-Aryans, Indo-Europeans, and Mongolians, all horseback riding. They exist in that zone. But then immediately beneath them, we have another culture circle that extends worldwide, which is, of course, the circle of high civilization, with the hieratic city-state that extends from Europe and goes across all the way to the New World, to Central America with Guatemala, and down the coast of South America with the Incan Peruvian civilization. So we have that zone. Then we have another circle, the fifth out of all these, which is the equatorial zone that we just discussed, that extends from West Africa and goes across through Madagascar, India, Melanesia, Polynesia, and on into the New World, where the primary myth is that of the buried human being from whose death and burial upsprings the first food plants that the community depends upon. You don't find that myth amongst the hunting myths. I've just gone through the historical atlas, The Way of the Animal Powers, read through all these animal hunting myths. Nowhere did I find the myth of an individual who was sacrificed, killed, buried, and from whose body a vegetation of some type thing sprang forth. That's not the myth of the hunting myths. The hunting myths has to do with killing the animal and talking to the animal and making an arrangement with the animal, an agreement that the animal will keep offering itself in return for the human to keep propitiating it through reverence, rites, magic, singing and dancing. Those songs keep the animals fertile and keep them coming. So that's the myth of the animal master and the way of the animal powers. That's the primary mythologum there that we'll be looking at in the second half of this book. So we have these culture zones that Campbell has studied going from west to east, and this dispersal is always from west to east. It begins, of course, in East Africa with the hominization process that migrates from south to north through Palestine to Europe with the Neanderthals, and then later the modern Homo sapiens. Then with circa 35,000 BC, we get the creative explosion with Cro-Magnon cave art, the Franco-Cantabrian province there. And as the glaciers then melt, with the Magdalenians winding everything up around 14,000 to 12,000 BC, there's a north to south migration, and we can track the art moving through the Sahara, through East Africa, down to South Africa. And that zone, by the way, that's another one of Frobenius's culture areas. The zone that arcs from the Sahara through East Africa to South Africa is the zone in which we find painted animal art all through that zone. We don't find sculpture there. The sculpture all occurs in the different zone in the Congo, in West Africa, amongst the tribes of West Africa, the jungles in the Congo. That's where all the sculpted art comes from. And so those two sort of miss each other. They're two different culture zones, two different zones. Painting in one zone, sculpture in the other zone. Two separate cultures there. And I think that probably, and Campbell mentions in The Way of the Animal Powers, probably the same thing went for the Paleolithic artists, because the Paleolithic artists we get, the sculpture comes out of Germany, actually, not France. It comes from Germany, and it's actually slightly older and earlier than the paintings. And the paintings come from France, especially from in and around the Pyrenees. And the earliest cave there is Chauvet, which is like 33,000 BC. But the earliest art from Eastern Europe, from Germany, from Vogelherd and Hohenstein-Stadel with the erect man lion, is sculpture, not painting. And it dates from about 35,000 BC, right? Just about the same time. So apparently the two, where they met in the Pyrenees and came together, you get the later phases of the Great Creative Explosion that begin to introduce relief. Like the Venus of Lausel is sculpted relief. It's sculpted, but it's also kind of rock art. It's relief. So it's like a combination of the sculpture and the painting that meet. 20,000 BC, we start getting all the Venus sculptures and Venus figurines migrating. The Venus of Willendorf is found in Austria and so forth. So we get all of that. So that is the way of the animal powers and the zones of migration that he tracks, going west to east. So what this chapter begins with is a Jicarilla Apache creation myth that we want to look at next. Now, there are 7 zones, as he outlines them in the Atlas. There are 7 zones of Native American culture in North America. So there's the Arctic zone, which is all Eskimo. So it goes around Alaska, around Canada, Hudson Bay, and along the shores of Greenland. That's one zone, the Arctic Eskimo zone, which is amongst the most primitive peoples in the world. Not using that term politically incorrectly, but they're very, very archaic peoples. And then the next zone we have, going down along the coast, the North Pacific coast, totem pole carvers. Then down in the south with California, we have the far western culture zone. And then moving into the southwest, we have the southwestern culture zone, which is composed largely of 3 different cultural amoebae. Spangler used to call these things amoebas, with the Hohokam in Arizona, the Anasazi at the Four Corners, and the Mugian in New Mexico. So we have those 3 in that zone. Then going back up to the area that Joel Garreau, by the way, it's fun to compare Joel Garreau's 9 Nations of North America with these 7 zones. There's some interesting overlaps. The area that Joel Garreau calls the Great Empty Quarter, up in Canada, is the area of the Plains Indians, going down, including the Rockies and the Front Range in front of them, going all the way down to the southwest. Those are the Plains Indians. And then next to them, we have the largest of these groupings with the Woodlands Indians, which is huge. It goes all the way from Alaska, across Canada, down to the eastern United States, to the Atlantic seaboard, and all the way down to Florida, the so-called Woodlands Indians, which are divided into 3 different groups: the Athabascan group, which is in Canada, then the Algonquian, which is actually older than the Athabascan, which occupies most of the woodland areas of eastern North America, and then along the Atlantic seaboard, the Iroquois, who are the absolute enemies of the Algonquians. Those two were, the Algonquians had teepees, but the Iroquois had these long houses in which they put, wooden long houses in which they put all their families and communities in just these long, almost Scandinavian-like long houses. Then I think the 7th grouping is the islands, just off the coast of Florida there with the island world, the Antilles and the Circumantilles, where those tribes are extinct, the Caribs and the Arawak, they're extinct. There's an 8th zone if we add Mesoamerica in there, but the problem with that is that Mesoamerica is a different culture world altogether from the rest of these guys. That's a hieratic city-state that belongs with the high peaks of civilization. It's a different world from these other 7 zones. And so the Jicarilla Apache then have come down. They're hunters who have come down from the north. The hunters are all in the north, by the way, and the agrarian planters are all in the south, which is interesting because the Civil War distinction between industrialists in the north and agrarian societies in the south was already there in a certain way, marked out by the Native American migrations, where the agrarian world had come up from Mesoamerica, where agriculture was invented and introduced, and then migrates north, so that the south was agrarian for the Native Americans, and the north was all hunters coming across from Siberia and the Bering Land Bridge during the last interglacial period, the Eemian interglacial period, perhaps that far back. That's a long ways back, maybe. But there are other periods where the land bridge was available and they could have come across. So we have all the hunters in the north. And so the Jicarilla come down from the plains and they convert to agriculture. When they get into the southwest, like the Navajo did, they convert and acculturate to the local agricultural societies. So we have here an example of a myth, a Jicarilla Apache creation myth, of a formerly hunting people who has now adapted themselves to an agrarian way of life. And so, proceeding with the myth goes that in the beginning there was darkness and water and cyclone, practically nothing, but there are these creator beings called the Haktsin, H-A-C-T-C-I-N, the Haktsin. These are the creator beings of the Apache, and they correspond to the Hopi the Pueblo dwellers, masked apparitions, the Kachinas, and all those kinds of figures. They're similar to that. So we have the Haxan, and the primary figure here is called Black Haxan. And I guess out of boredom, he decides to create out of clay the first animals. So he creates this generic tetrapod out of clay. And he says, what can you do for me? So the thing walks around. He says, that's pretty good. I think I can probably use you. But you're going to need companions. And so he causes this clay figurine to spontaneously generate all the world's animals. And they start sparkling and producing out of this one single being, which reminds me, actually, of the Polynesian myth of Tangaroa, the creative god, who exists in a work of art as a single vertical being that has all these little gods germinating out of his body. They're actually coming out of his body. So there's it's interesting the way these myths echo across space and time. They echo each other. And so he's created the animals, and so Black Haxan decides, he puts out his palm, a drop of water falls into it, he mixes it with a little bit of dirt to create mud, and he creates the world's first bird. He says, well, what can you do? The bird flies up and twitters around. He says, I think I can use you. That's pretty good. But you're going to need companions. So he grabs the bird, and he swings it around like an Australian Aborigine swinging a bull roarer, swings it around in a clockwise direction that emanates all the other birds from it. Eagles and hawks and doves, they all come out of this. And indeed, there is an Australian Aboriginal myth that one of the ancestor beings emerges from the swinging of a bull roarer. It just splits off from the tip of the bull roarer. Reminds me of that. So we have that echo. And so we have the birds. And the birds are hungry now, so they want food. They say, what will we eat? So Haxan takes a bunch of seeds in his palm, sprinkles them around, and they turn into worms, insects, and grasshoppers. And the grasshoppers are bouncing around, and the birds are having a hard time getting them, and Haxan thinks it's very funny. He likes that it's funny. It's good entertainment for him. So all the animals and the birds and the insects have been created, and now they come to Black Haxan and they say, we want man. Create man for us. We want a companion to be with us. And so Black Haxan says, okay, I can do that, but what you'll need to do is go to the four quarters and bring back precious gems and minerals, everything you can find. So the animals go out to all these different directions, and they bring back red ochre, they bring back white clay, they bring back jet, opal, abalone, turquoise, all these minerals and gems. And meanwhile, Black Haxan has made a human form on the ground using pollen. He's sprinkled this white outline of himself so that the human form is based on the form that he has, and makes it on the ground, then loads it up with all these gems and minerals. Red ochre becomes his blood, white stones become bones, the turquoise becomes the blue veins, and so forth. So he puts this thing, packs it all together, and he tells the bird, stay away, it's not done yet. And lying on the ground face down, arms akimbo, is the first man, and he says, sit up. So this creature raises itself up, this sort of golem-like creature, and he says, get up. And it walks around, and he teaches it how to talk, how to walk around, how to laugh. And the birds start chirping, and there's lots of song going on. But then the birds come to him, and they say, well, he needs a companion. You can't just have him by himself. So he says, Haxan says, you're right. So he puts him to sleep, and the man sleeps, and he dreams of the first woman. He wakes up, and the woman is beside him. We can tell that there might be some Christian missionary echoes that have leaked into this myth, I think, from the Old Testament. I think have leaked in here. It's too close to the creation myth in the Old Testament for this to be an accident. They get up. They love each other. The birds are singing. Everyone's happy. The first man, first woman are having a great time. So now all of this took place not on the world as it is today, but in the world below, in the underworld. So they're down in this sort of cultural incubator, this womb-like underworld with a hole at the top of the sort of world ceiling. And there's another Haxan figure down there with them called White Haxan. And the two of them decide to start to make the sun and the moon. So each one produces a little miniature disk of the sun, the other one produces the moon, and they put them up on the world ceiling, but they're going from north to south. So it's in a different direction. And so they're doing this in a different direction. And so the shamans, meanwhile, there are shamans now amongst the people. All the people have reproduced, and now we've got shamans. And the shamans now get into arguments claiming credit for who made these two planets. One shaman goes, no, I made the sun. Another one goes, no, I made it. Another one goes, I made the moon. So they have all these disputes. But meanwhile, the sun and the moon disappear through that hole in the world ceiling, which is why we have eclipses. And they disappear out into the world above. And so the Haxan come to the shamans and say, well, if you have all this power, then bring back the sun and the moon. So the shamans say, okay, we're going to do that. So here it goes. So the shamans now all gather, and they start doing tricks. One shaman falls down beneath the earth, and he leaves his eyeballs up on the ground behind him, and he comes back, puts the eyeballs back in like a cartoon character. Another shaman swallows a spruce tree whole, spits it back up. Another shaman will swallow arrows and pull them out of his stomach. So they're doing all these wonderful shamanistic tricks, but they can't bring the sun and the moon back. And so Black Haxan says, you guys are all very entertaining, but you're not bringing the sun and the moon back. I think we need to give the animals a try. So the animals come in, and they are sent to the four quarters to try to bring the sun and the moon back, but they can't either. But what they do bring back is all the food. They bring back maize and cherries and blackberries and breadfruit and all the basic food staples. So the animals bring all of that back, all the basic food staples, and they can't bring back the sun and the moon. So the Haxan have to intervene, and Black Haxan brings about 4 different thunderbolts with clouds from the 4 different directions, and he draws a little sand painting on the ground where he makes 4 mounds that the thunder roars over and seeds these 4 mounds with these little tiny seeds, these 4 mounds. And the 4 mounds then slowly accumulate and coalesce into a single mountain that begins to rise up. And now the Haxan then appoint 12 shamans, 12 particularly gifted shamans. 6 of them are painted blue for the summer festivals. 6 of them are painted white for the winter festivals. And they're known as the Sanati Society, and they add 6 clowns. So they enlist the powers of these shamans and clowns, the powers of the animals, and the Haxan have to all cooperate to make this mountain rise. And at this point, Campbell intervenes and he says, this reminds me a lot of the myth of the churning of the Milky Ocean, the Hindu myth, in which the gods and the anti-gods, the gods and the titans, have to cooperate around the central churning stick of the world mountain, Mount Mandara, to use Vasuki, the world serpent, which they wrap around it, and both the gods on one side, the anti-gods on the other, pull it to make a spindle that spins the Milky Ocean, which is, of course, the Milky Way, from out of which all kinds of creative things come. And basically, yes, it's the same myth, and it's weird how these myths have these echoes that just carry across time and space. Distance doesn't seem to stop them. They just keep carrying across. It's also this idea, though, that Campbell points out, like in Hesiod's Theogony, of the war of the new generation of gods against the older generation of gods that has now been discredited. The Titans, the Gigantomachy, and the Titanomachy that Hesiod recounts, with Zeus fighting the Titans and so forth, becoming victorious over them and shutting them down into various underworlds across the earth, is always an illustration of new gods coming in, fighting the gods that were there in the land before the incomers came in and discrediting them and putting them down into underworlds. And of course here, the older gods are the shamans, who are now made fools out of. They're regarded as ridiculous, left over from the hunting myths when the Heckerilla were formerly hunters. Now they've moved into a new horizon of priests coming in rather than shamans now, and taking over the official order and discrediting the shamans, making fun of them. And now we have this new separate world order where the Haxan are the primary divinities, and they're always the same for each generation. So, and the myth then ends, of course, with this mountain coming up through the world hole, and 4 ladders being built on each side of it, and the people crawl up the ladders and they come out to the world. It's one of the popular emergence myths that we find going all over the Southwest, and indeed all over the Native American world. So that's that myth. Now, what's interesting about it, if you contrast it with the Ojibwe myth that we talked about last time for the origin of maize, the Ojibwe, too, were a formerly hunting people that has come down from the north and picked up the agricultural myths, which is why they have the myth for the origin of maize about where Wunj has to wrestle with a vision quest deity that he has to bury, and from his burial comes up the first maize plant. That's an agricultural myth, but the first half of the myth is shamanistic, because shamanism is based on the individual vision quest. So it's Campbell's got this sort of difference engine between the shaman and the priest, the hunters and the planters. And the shaman is one who goes out on an individual vision quest alone in the wilderness. They always take him, they put him out somewhere. It could be a woman just as well. And they put them out somewhere in a house, build a little hut around them, and they have to starve. They have to fast for days and days and days, sometimes weeks. And they might be given little tiny bits of food to eat. But they fast, and as they fast, they have visions. And visions come to them of unpredictable beings. These aren't the revealed gods that are pre-established for the tribe by the priesthood. These are unique animal familiars and masters that appear to the shaman. And in the Ojibwe myth, we see that the being that appears to him would have been an animal if it was a hunting myth, but instead it's a food plant in human form that comes to him. So we can see that the divide between the hunting myths in the north of North America and the planting myths of the agrarian zone of the south are not 100% black and white, because these tribes have been shifting around a lot. They move into back and forth between the zones. The Ojibwe are woodlands Indians who moved down into this agrarian zone. The Jicarilla Apache are plains Indians who moved down into this agricultural zone. And then you get another group like the Sioux Indians, who were originally an agricultural people who move up and migrate to the northern plains, where they pick up the buffalo hunt and become partially hunting, partially agrarian. So you get a lot of these cultural hybrids that move back and forth between these domains. But so now this chapter is centered on the contrast between the shaman and the priest, which is essential for Campbell here. This is his difference engine. And as Derrida says, every metaphysical bivalent ontology presupposes a difference engine in which one of the two pairs is privileged over the other. And I think Campbell clearly privileges the hunting world of the shamans with its individualism over the planting world governed by the priest with its conformity, with his idea that the individual has to conform to the group order. Because these shamans, as he illustrates in the second chapter, the second subchapter of this section, are very dangerous, feared and revered individuals. He talks about the two Eskimo shamans, Igjagarjuk and Najagnek, who were Eskimo shamans interviewed by Dr. Rasmussen way back, decades back, turn of the century. And Igjagarjuk was this individual who wanted this woman in his tribe, and he and his brother armed themselves, and I guess the tribe didn't want him to have her, so they went to war and they just killed her entire family and took the woman. So these guys are not saints. They're very dangerous individuals, and they're so strong that they can actually stand up to a tribe of about 25 people, let's say, is what these tribes are normally composed of. The shaman can stand up to the rest of the tribe. Plus, he has all these magical powers. Najagnek was another one of these fellows who went to war against his tribe, holed himself up inside of his house, turned it into a fortification, and took shots at the rest of his tribe. When he was taken captive and dragged to Nome to stand trial, he had murdered a number of individuals. They brought in individuals from his village to testify against him. And when those villagers went into the courtroom and they looked at him, they lowered their heads in shame. None of them would testify against him, and the charges were dropped. They were terrified of him. You don't fuck with shamans. That's the thing. Shamans have immense power, and they're not just, the rationalists, the skeptics reviewing this material try to present these fellows as tricksters. They're just card-sharp magicians. They're not. They have access to actual magical powers, like yogis have access to siddhis, right? They can perform miracles that are real, that are actual. They have access to what Gene Gebser called the magical consciousness structure, which is a real structure of consciousness that can be dived down into and accessed in such a way that you can make actual magical effects happen. If a shaman puts a curse on you, chances are you're going to have bad luck. That's just the way this works. And if it didn't work this way, these shamans wouldn't be feared and revered the way that they are. Nobody's afraid of a magician. A magician can entertain you with card tricks, but only a shaman can put the fear of God into you. I mean, that's a whole different thing. These guys have power. They're very powerful individuals, and they've attained all their power through that fasting where they've gone into the vision quest and just soaked up spiritual energy through celibacy and fasting. Those two things, and they acquire enormous amounts of power and return to their village as individuals to be feared. So they occupy a very precarious position in their society, because if anything goes wrong in the society, if somebody gets sick, let's say, and the shaman can't cure him, he might be in trouble. They might decide to do away with him, the villagers. They might kill him off, or a rival shaman might kill him. The shamans are very much afraid of each other, just as the villagers are afraid of them. So that's this. We'll stop there with this resumption of Campbell's Masks of God about halfway through the chapter on shamanism.